Welcome, everyone. I hope you had a great conference so far. We're going to get started. My name is Gladys Andino from Research Computing, and I'm just going to be facilitating things this afternoon. And so one of the few housekeeping items that we have is no audio or recording is allowed in the room, please. You are allowed to tweet, and you can use the hashtag Dan or Dune to do that. And so here are some spaces here at the front, so you can take these ones. We're going to have at the end a time for 3 to 5 minutes questions, and we're going to be passing the microphone around for if you need it. And so our speaker today is Dan Goldwasser. He's actually an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science here at Purdue. His research interests are in the area of natural language processing and application of machine learning for textual data. His work focuses on real-world applications, such as machine learning comprehension and political discourse analysis, which they require machine learning algorithms capable of connecting raw textual data and word knowledge and dynamic real-world behaviors. And so the talk today is going to be teaching computers how to identify ideology using IA to deduce bias in social media and new articles. So please, everyone take a moment to silence your devices and just feel free to tweet.
Thank you for the introduction. So for people in the back, there's some more chairs here if you need to. So hi everyone. My name is Dan Goldwasser. I'm from the Computer Science Department, and my area of research is natural language processing. This is slow. And specifically, I'm very interested in understanding and identifying biases in the way we express our views, the way we process information, and finding ways in which computers can try and replicate the same type of decisions that we are making when we're reading or we have access to this information. We live in interesting times. I think we can all agree on that. This thing is really loud. We live in interesting times, and it seems like everything around us is changing, right? The way our political landscape is changing, the type of conversations and discussion we have with our friends are changing. We're now doing a lot of it on social media. The type of events that are being reported are different. And if we have to, or in some sense, I can summarize the difficulty of computers dealing with these changes in the word I introduced this concept, interesting. It's all clear to us that when I say this is interesting, I'm saying something bad or challenging or not positive. However, if you look at the dictionary definition for the word interesting, which computers can have access to, they would find something completely different. Allowing computers to understand the common meaning or the intended meaning of language is the main technical challenge that I'm going to try and talk about today. In general, I prefer if this talk was the least formal as possible. So if you have questions or if there are things that I say that you feel like you need some more explanations, please feel free to raise your hand and ask, or just ask, and I'll be happy to accommodate. All right, so from a 10,000 feet view, natural language processing is the way computers can deal with human languages. Unlike machine languages, such as, I don't know, Java or Python, which computers are really, really good at, much more than humans, natural language presents a challenge. It's extremely messy. People don't always say what they mean. They sometimes say what they mean, but they say it in ways that are indirect. However, despite these challenges, there have been several recent advances. And in fact, all of you are using some variation or another of a natural language processing system. You might do it by communicating with your phone through Siri or Google Now or Cortana or Amazon Echo. There seem to be more and more these days. You might be using Google Translate to translate a message that looks interesting but written in a language that you're not familiar with. That's also an NLP system. Even just trying to identify the product that you're after on Amazon requires some degree of NLP. So one of the things that really sort of drove the popularity of NLP is the fact that we're all connected on the web today, and most of the web is textual. hence the need to process text on a massive scale. So in a nutshell, what we're dealing with NLP is moving from unstructured data, text, and trying to move it to structured information. This could be extracting information from news articles to tell us what's going on in the world, trying to identify if a review for a product is positive or negative, and as a result, the machine can give us a recommendation for whatever product we want to buy, and so on. And indeed, like the two most popular applications historically for NLP have been information extractions, where we try to extract facts from text, and sentiment analysis, where we try to analyze opinionated texts and try to figure out if there is positive or negative sentiment. This landscape is changing, and it's changing fast, because there are the way we communicate has changed dramatically over the last 10 years with the rise of social media. So in social media, we have very valuable information. We definitely have motivation for trying to understand the discussion on social media. We can think about it as a dynamic source for news, where we don't have to rely on a news first of all, a physical newspaper that changes once a day, or even a news website that changes every 10 or 15 minutes. On Twitter, the news is reported as it happens. And if we have a way to mine it, well, we can continuously update our understanding of the world. We can try to understand better than any polling system what is the public sentiment about different policy issues by observing how they're discussed on social media. We can try to understand how people discuss things and what are the political divisions in the general public, all of this in an automated way. From an NLP perspective, unlike the previous view of the world where we have facts and we need to extract them, dealing with this kind of data requires us to deal with this weird mixture of facts and opinions and what has been famously named alternative facts, where this refers to a very biased view of the world, and we somehow need to put it together and come up with a coherent story that explains what's going on social media. So for NLP to keep growing, we have to deal with this challenge. In this talk, I'll try to share my biased thoughts on this topic and the type of work we do in my lab here at Purdue. Just a spoiler alert, I have many questions about answers. I'm not sure I have definite answers, but I do have intuitions that I hope to share with you. All right, so in some sense, the rise of social media has been mostly described in a negative way. One thing that has been, or two things that have been very popular, scary talking points about social media. One of them is, of course, fake news that sort of made an appearance in the 2016 presidential elections and since then has kind of stayed with us. The idea behind fake news that we have the means to spread information. However, the validity and correctness of this information is not necessarily verified beforehand. And as a result, information that is highly biased or completely untrue is accepted as true information. In some sense, I prefer the term information stylist, which is both a humorous attempt, but also it captures the nature of this phenomenon, because the news are not fake in some random way. They are fake in a systematic way. They are there to confirm some initial biases that we have and to try and manipulate us to make some decision that we wouldn't otherwise make. Another thing that is usually negatively discussed is the toxicity of social media, the fact that we can hide behind this veil of anonymity when we are on social media allows us to express a very extreme opinion, be abusive towards others, and so on. This is just a couple of examples of what happens when you write toxic social media on Google and Google News, and these are several recent discussions that I found. And I think this image summarizes it in the best way. So this is a frog sitting on the toilet while using social media. I will let you search for the hashtag associated with this image. So we have a problem, right? We have a problem because as a result of these technological trends, we can now, our ability to trust information that we have access to is damaged. The kind of discussions we can have with our peers and our friends have been also damaged because they include a lot more abusive content we would otherwise like to see. And in both cases, technology is to blame, right? Like we have somehow let down our old information safeguards and allow this influx of information, and this is the result. And in some sense, the whole idea behind Dawn or Doom is the question of trying to find a balance between the perils and the advantages of new technologies. So in some sense, maybe the story that I'm telling you is that, well, if technology has created this problem, or at least contributed to it, maybe technology can also fix it. And maybe this is the main technological challenge that we need to deal with when we're building natural language processing systems. So this is a good question. Like I said, I don't have answers. However, I do like to somehow, in some sense, question the question. And my key intuition here is that, well, is this really a new problem? Is there something new about this technology that has resulted in this influx of fake news, incorrect information, biased information, and so on? And again, a picture tells 1,000 words. So this is an internet meme of Abraham Lincoln with the text, "The problem with internet quotes is that you cannot always depend on their accuracy," attributed to Abraham Lincoln. This is, of course, fake news. However, it's a good segue for the following slide and looking at the 19th century version of fake news. In this case, this was the election campaign just before the Civil War, where the Republican, Abraham Lincoln, and a Democrat candidate were going head-to-head, and the Democratic opponents of Abraham Lincoln spread this pamphlet showing what was then a taboo of cultural integrations between African Americans and Caucasians, and they attributed this to a policy item by Lincoln. This was picked up by the internet of the time, the printed press, and was spread around, right? And it sort of became viral at the time. It sounds very familiar if you think about it. Just to make sure that I give a balanced view, in the previous election cycle, Abraham Lincoln and sponsors in the Republican Party purchased several Illinois newspapers to help spread their message, right? So in some sense, the fact that we have access to new technology gives rise to biased opinions. If you fast forward about 100 years later, you see that when film became the new technology of the day, it was also adopted by different political ideology to try and promote their agenda. So most famously, Leni Riefenstahl created very sort of monumental films for the Nazi Party, promoting their ideology. And about 10 years later, Hollywood, at the beginning of the Second World War, created a series of movies called Why We Fight, explaining the motivation and justification for the US entering the war. And again, just to make clear, I'm not claiming any moral equivalence. However, I am trying to show that technology was used again and again to try and promote a political ideology. And yet, somehow we feel that things are different. Like somehow, if you think about our vision of journalism and the sort of the democratic safeguard offered by journalism, we think about Walter Cronkite at the 60s, a very trusted journalist. And when we think about the way we consume this kind of information, we have a paper route, and this is how we consume. And somehow it turned into this hot mess of celebrity gossip and that's propagated through social media, right? Where the idea is that what was once a very well-curated information source that was spread through very traditional circulation now has very broad access, and there is really no way of telling if the information you get is true or not, right? Okay, so there are many things that contributed to this. What was originally sort of very traditional and well-curated sources. Over time, regulation kind of winded down. And if you want to try and sort of track this change, we moved from newspapers that changed very, very slowly to news websites that changed dynamically and are less accountable to the public, to finally to social website and news circulation through the social website, where pretty much every person that uses these platforms is now an editor and a journalist that contributes to this cycle. What ended, in terms of the information landscape, what was once a very sort of centrist point of view, I'm using here CNN as sort of like the centrist voice, resulted in sort of dedicated news sources both for the left and the right-wing sides of the maps, right? So on the right hand, we have outlets like Fox News. On the left-hand side, I don't know, I think Jon Stewart, sort of in a funny, and each one of those news sources caters to a different population, right? And there's really no attempt to try and find a middle ground of objective truth, but rather the line between entertainment and news is somewhat blurred. So here's an exercise for the audience. Here are two news articles discussing the same issue. This is the alleged Russian intervention in the 2016 election, 2016 presidential election through Facebook users. Which one of those? So they're describing the same event. Are they describing it in the same way? Why not? The bottom one, you mean? What facts? Okay. Why is this meaningful? Exactly. So despite the fact that they're both describing the same news event, they highlight very different facts, right? So in the one at the top, they emphasize the fact that it was after the elections already occurred, making it an impossibility to actually affect anything that happened in the past. They're also putting Russian advertisement in these sort of quotes, expressing some doubt about the correctness of this expression. Where here at the bottom one, they focus on the fact that there was some monetary involvement, and it is more likely to have resulted in some influence, right? So despite the fact that this is the same event, you would come up with very different views about what happened after reading different sources.
Even on that first one, if you just worded it, about half of the advertisements appeared before the election.
Mm-hmm. In the first one?
Yeah. More than half appeared after the election,
right.
Which means about half appeared before it.
Right, but this is an implication that you're making as a reader, right? So they emphasize the fact that, well, at least half you can't really do anything with. If you had to guess about who's behind the first and the second one, let's say, who's likely to be behind the first one? Okay. So the top one is from Russia Today, RT.com. The bottom one is from NewYorkTimes.com. Russia Today is often characterized as being a Kremlin-motivated news outlet. And indeed, it reflects something that minimizes the involvement of the Russian government in the presidential elections. All right, so we have to be careful when we read the news. So social news are really contextualized by us. Like they are designed to cater to our original biases. They're designed to become viral within certain communities. They're personalized in the sense that news platforms identify our own biases, and then they provide us with things that we would happily consume. And this is sometimes, the result of that was sometimes named information echo chambers, where our own ideas just get reinforced over and over again. Another version of the social news is on Twitter. In this case, we don't even have a real news narrative to try and describe what's going on, but rather it's a hashtag or it's a very short tweet. This is a slide that I added about, I don't know, 30 minutes ago, showing what's the hot trend on Twitter. And you can think about this as a way to update, like a news web page on a minute-by-minute basis, right? So if you look at it, this is from today, and today is election day. So the most trendy hashtag is election day. If you actually click on it and we try to see what people are saying with respect to this hashtag or this topic marker, we can get a couple of different things. So it's election days, people vote. Who do you think the top one voted for? Who do you think the bottom one voted for? Sorry? Mm-hmm. How about the bottom? Why? Healthcare. All right, so the first one, the top one, is easier to determine. You're saying, well, 30.7% unemployment, which is sort of economic achievement attributed to the Trump administration. Nancy Pelosi is a Democrat speaker, and the two are sort of positioned one against the other. In the second tweet, this is a lot more nuanced. We have to know something about policies regarding healthcare pushed in the Democratic Party, and as a result, you make the connection that if somebody mentions elections in the context of a health issue, it is likely to indicate that they would vote for the party that would sort of champion healthcare. I'm sorry? Corrected. So my point here is not to reiterate the same policy discussion that have been covered in the news over and over again, but rather to make you think about the following point. It's clear that the first one was easier for you than the second one, but in terms of building a computer algorithm that can make either one of these decisions correctly, that's really hard, right? I have to know a lot about the world. I have to know that these expressions have political meaning. I need to know that Nancy Pelosi is a Democrat. I need to know something about healthcare conditions and policy items. Representing it in a computer, in an artificially intelligent system, is extremely difficult. Right? And this is one of the core issues that we have. So here's the question. Can we build artificially intelligent systems that can analyze such news, sort of biased news articles, and political discourse on Twitter, right? In some sense, you can take the doom approach that, well, it's so difficult, there's so much working against it, we won't be able to do it. We can take the dawn approach where, well, this is something that AI has contributed to, and as a result, AI can fix it. And my short answer is, I don't know. Time will tell. What I can try and do is present the technical challenges that are involved in building systems that can account for such difficult texts. Who recognizes this? Okay. I'm somewhat encouraged by the fact that people recognize this reference, given the fact that it's a movie from the late 60s. So this is how a vicious computer system controlling a spacecraft that was described in the movie and book, Space Odyssey. In this book, HAL is taking over the ship and is slowly killing off one crew member after the other. At some point, there's only one left, Dave. Dave recognizes that HAL is behind the mysterious deaths of the crew members, and he comes up with the idea that he can go to the mainframe room and just, pull the plug, like literally. It's a computer, it needs electricity. However, in order to get to this room, Dave has to open the door, and HAL controls everything. So Dave asks, and this is like one of those highlights in the movies, this is the dramatic moment where Dave asks HAL to open the bay door, and HAL says, "I'm sorry, Dave, I'm afraid I cannot do it." And this is one of the most highly quoted sentences when people want to scare you about AI. So there is an implication here, right, about the degree of AI and the degree of natural language understanding that a computer system needs to have in order to give this response, right? So You need to understand something about the meaning of the words. You need to be able to ground the meaning of the words in a physical environment. Like it's not just any door or door is a dictionary item, but rather this specific concrete one leading to this room. But the thing that I guess we find most puzzling is the ability of Hal's ability to understand that if it were to open the door, Dave would disconnect him. This is not a desirable outcome for Hal. And Hal was able to reflect on the possible outcome and say, well, I don't want to do something that would end up harming me. And this is really where, when we think about artificial intelligence or when we think about building computer systems that can reason about intended meaning, this is what we're after. This is the underlying capability that's so elusive. And that's the doom. Now let's talk about the dawn. So we all have Siri or Cortana or some variation of a personal assistant. If you were to think about the next generation of Siri, where your boss just asked you to stay late for the second time this week, and you had plans, and you're really upset, and it's late, and you're angry, and you don't care if you get fired, and you're just about to send him that email telling him exactly what you think of them. And then Siri says, I'm sorry, Dave. I don't think it's a good idea. So that's actually not that unthinkable, right? Like in some sense, you can say, well, Siri or whatever system you have needs to know something about who's your boss and what's the meaning of boss, and need to understand that certain words should not appear ever when you're emailing your boss, and maybe in general they should not appear, right? So characterizing an email content as angry and understanding that displaying angry emotions to your boss is not a good idea, is not something unthinkable. Right? So to a large extent, our ability to deal with the challenges that modern NLP requires have to do with finding ways in which we can characterize a smaller version or an easier version of the problem that still has the same intended functionality. Right? And this sort of is a major shift from old school artificial intelligence introduced in the 90s, 50s by John McCarthy and his colleagues, where they thought that perfect artificial intelligence was a summer project. This is not a joke. They actually have an NSF proposal for a summer project intended to solve AI. It's amusing. All right, so NLP has made significant progress. So things like personal assistance is something that is now common practice. Until 2010, 2011, it was not. And we were used to thinking about automated answering systems as the most obnoxious and annoying thing in the world. And now Siri can tell every once in a while a funny joke or have at least pleasant interactions within a limited scope. We can also think about sentiment analysis, where we want to find the best product ever, and we're, instead of us looking through the technical specification of the new laptop that we want to buy, we would just ask the system to look at product reviews for laptops and give us the one that has really good reviews. Right? So we can find, if we care about a specific aspect, for example, the display, we can specifically say, well, find reviews that describe laptops with really, really great display. Right? So we can think about it, we can have a point of a view of this as, well, I'm giving you a piece of text, give me a structured record that says associate with each one of the aspects of the product something good or bad, right? And we call this aspect-based sentiment analysis. And in some sense, we're saying, okay, this is, again, not something that is super challenging. You have words indicative of products or features. You have words indicative of positive and negative emotions. Just put the two together. And as usual, the plot thickens. So here are examples where these kind of things break. So you can think, so here's a comparison. Dude, I just watched this horror flick. The selling points are nightmare scenes, torture scenes, terrible monster. It was so bad. Here's a negative review. Don't buy the popcorn. It was terrible. The monsters selling it must have wanted to torture me. It was so bad, it gave me nightmares. So two reviews with opposite sentiment. One is positive and one is negative. However, the vocabulary is almost identical. And we see that certain words that are used negatively in one are used positively in another. And in some sense, this is the main challenge of NLP. It's inherently ambiguous, and it depends on the context in which you use the words. So another sort of fun example is teachers strike idle kids, which, if you think about it, could either make you very concerned or make you smile. So teacher strike could either mean the teacher hit kids because they're idle, or because teachers go on strike, the kids are sort of bored and don't have anything to do. Right? The sentence itself doesn't contain enough information in order to distinguish between the two. Okay? Depending on the sentences that contextualize the sentence, for example, police was called, teacher, you would understand that it is one meaning or another. So differentiating between the two is our challenge. One of the ways in which we do it, or the main way in which we do it today, is through using machine learning algorithms. And the idea here is that we don't want to manually characterize the different ways in which words appear and in what context, but rather we're going to say we have a very, very large corpus. We have a very large collection of data. If we provide labels indicating what is the right judgment, the system should be able to replicate these decisions on its own. So for example, if we understand that the context for idle kids teacher strike is police or arrest or, I don't know, child safety, we understand that it's one meaning compared to the other. This is not a perfect solution. However, it works really, really well for many tasks. And today, all of the modern NLP systems rely on one variation or another of a machine learning system. From, again, like the 100,000 feet view, you can think about it as trying to capture salient patterns in the text. For example, words such as awesome would be indicative of positive. Words such as terrible would be indicative of negative sentiment. And try to build a representation that captures these patterns into a single decision. Right? So the question is, what kind of patterns can you represent? Right? If the patterns are things like, sentiment analysis that relies on words like terrible and awesome, then we're pretty much done. Unfortunately, if we deal with other problems, such as, let's say, take something like fake news detection, where you can think about it as a little bit like sentiment. I'm giving you like a news article. Instead of telling me positive or negative sentiment, tell me if it's describing real events or not. So if we take something like, I don't know, Ireland is now accepting Trump refugees from America, this is fake news. If we were to replace Trump refugees from America to Assad refugees from Syria, then maybe it is plausible. Right? So depending on the world knowledge and relevant context that is not available in the text, a sentence would be more or less plausible. Right? And then the question is, well, it's not in the text. We cannot represent it as a pattern that our machine learning algorithm can work with. What can we do? Right? We are sort of at an impasse. OK, so here's the fun part of my talk, which unfortunately, as usual, I'm running out of time. So what can we do about it? So we need to add additional information that would help contextualize it. In our first attempt, we tried to look at satirical news versus real news. This is work that we did a while ago. Here are two news snippets. One is real, one is not. Which one do you think is real? People who've taken my class don't answer. So come on, which one is the fake news? It's pretty hard. Why is it hard? OK, right, because they're kind of odd, right? Like, well, this is the president, the vice president. We don't really expect them to be in an environment where illegal substances or, I don't know, addictive substances are around and so on. But if you think about it more specifically, well, you can say, well, news describe odd events. And the question is, what is odd versus implausible? The idea that the vice president would actively barge in and look for somebody to give him a cup of clean urine so he could pass a drug test is really implausible. However, the president being, when visiting a state in which marijuana is legal, being offered, I don't know, some illegal substances, is actually not that it's unlikely, it's newsworthy, but it's not impossible. And again, the question is, how can we build a system that would recognize it? So I'll skip some of the technical details. What we try to do is characterize the type of actions that are described in the article, who is the intended recipient, and who is the agent that's performing them. And we try to build to provide the machine automatically with some expectations about what kind of actions are different people likely to do. Right? So in this case, we don't just rely on the data that's explicit in the text. For example, I don't know, Joe Biden was rushed into the room, but rather say, instead of speaking about Joe Biden, let's build a set of expectations around the people that are holding this office or have the same demographic information as that person. And we try to generalize over that. This resulted in a different view of the world, where we move from making a single classification over the text, but rather we put together many different considerations in our reasoning systems, and then we learn how to reason over the inputs that we have to get a sort of a broader, consistent outcome. In general, we have a significant challenge when we're dealing with narrative text, and the problem, if we have to put it in a single line, is how do we provide computers with common sense? How can we, depending on the type of information that we see, reason about the likely causes, the likely outcomes of events we see in the text? Right? So this is work that we're currently doing, where we're trying to think about input events. So for example, Jenny went into a restaurant, and then we can say, well, what would be the reason for going into the restaurant? And we give the computer multiple options. One is that it was raining outside, another one that she had some time to kill, another one that she was very hungry. And the computer needs to understand that these events are likely causes for going into a restaurant. Parking her car is not a good one. Right? So the computer has some preference with respect to a specific relation type. Similarly, we can try to find contrast between events. We can try to talk about temporal relationships, and so on. All right. So our next challenge is to deal with social media. And in this case, we move from long narrative text into this sort of very focused, succinct text that often doesn't even have a grammatical sentence structure. Right? It's a good question, how do we even deal with this? To do this, we specifically look at political tweets, because one of the main motivations for that, because Twitter is exploding as means for politicians to communicate with their constituencies. So unlike traditional outlets in which, like an ad that politicians run on TV, the discussion on Twitter or the message on Twitter is interactive. It's part of a broader conversations. They can respond to people who follow them. They can adapt their message. And in some sense, what we need to do is to find a way to track how this conversation changes, right? Without needing to actually sit down and interpret every individual hashtag independently, which is a very painstaking process. My computer is stuck. Okay, all right. So our main intuition is that political messaging is a very, very highly engineered thing. It's not something that politicians wake up in the morning and then they tweet about what lovely breakfast they had. Sometimes that happens. Most of the time, there is some agenda that they're trying to promote, and there is a way, or there are several talking points that help contribute to that. So we want to sort of reverse engineer the reasoning, or the way in which they explain the reasoning for their policy issues. We use a mechanism known as framing, which is what is the frame or what is the context in which you discuss political issues. You can think about that as sort of an abstraction of a reason. For example, if you want to think about something like the gun control debate, so this is a Democrat, John Lewis, addressing Speaker Ryan, talking about gun control. And in this case, the discussion around gun control is framed around the victims and families of gun violence. A Republican news outlet, when talking about Obamacare or the Affordable Health Care Act, stresses the rising costs of government-sanctioned health care. Right? So in both cases, there is an underlying stance about each one of those policy items. The frame is the justification or the context in which I discuss the policy item. It's clear that if I am against the Affordable Health Care Act, I would not talk about, oh, it brought value to so many people that were without insurance, but rather I would frame it as something that has to do with fiscal responsibility, emphasizing the cost of implementing such policies. In this case, the stance is quite straightforward. If we look at these tweets, we can infer what they're talking about. And again, this is something that it's a very convenient framework for analyzing social media. So this is a couple of examples that we have from our papers. So discussing gun control either as something that has to do with safety or as a constitutional policy point. And we can see that people that have similar stances are likely to discuss gun control or whatever policy item that is being discussed using the same kind of frames. It would be framed in the same way. In other cases, the underlying stances could be harder to decode. Right? So these are, again, around the issue of gun control. And this is two tweets that were issued by two politicians, one from the left and one from the right, after a mass shooting, an unfortunate mass shooting event, one in Las Vegas and another in Stoneman Douglas High School. If you had to guess which one which one of the people tweeting these messages has a pro-gun control and which one opposes gun control?
I'll guess that the top one opposes gun control.
Opposes gun control. Why?
They mentioned prayers.
Mm-hmm.
Correlated with the political right.
Okay. Yes, I didn't notice that. It's a good point. Okay. Other things?
The second one uses horrific shooting, unspeakable horror.
Okay.
The first one is heartbreaking news. The second one seems to address more the gun violence.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So that's kind of the point I was trying to make. So there are despite the fact that both of these express sorrow and about this unfortunate event, they describe the event using different words. In the first one, the author emphasizes social unity, like we stand together, we pray together, we mourn together, and so on. Our prayers, again, this sort of we language, which is very inclusive. In the second one, the author focuses on the shooting event itself, mentioning things like horrific or unspeakable horror. And we want to find a way, again, as people working with decoding these kind of messages automatically, we want to find a way to automatically identify it, right? Not to have to go through the process that we just did. And the question is, what are the dimensions of analysis that we should have? In this case, again, we turn to social science theory, and we work with a morality theory called moral foundations, developed by John Haidt and Graham about a decade ago. And the idea here is that you can try and discuss human morality through a sort of a social and evolutionary perspective as being focused around several main themes. These themes have evolved around protecting society as a whole and protecting the individual over time, right? And as a result of these moral foundations, social norms have formed. So these have to do with things like care and harm, so protecting people that need protection and saying something, having a negative moral judgments against people who are harming those people, positive judgment for fairness, and vice versa for cheating, loyalty and betrayal, authority and subversion, purity and degradation. And each one of them emphasizes a different perspective. So when we're saying things like, united we stand, we're talking about things that have to do with social cohesiveness, right? So the loyalty betrayal, talking about solidarity, patriotism, and so on, as a positive moral stand. When we're talking about the horrific shooting, we're taking a very sort of visceral response to something traumatic that happened, which would be reflected in the purity degradation moral foundation. If we were able to automatically identify these, it gives us a platform to which we can analyze those tweets and try to infer what is likely to be the underlying ideology of the person. Another fun example that we found when we looked at the data, let's take a look at the one at the right. 30,000 Americans dying to gun violence. Still, I'm moving to North Carolina where it's safe to go to the bathroom. It's sort of tempting to focus on violence, on gun violence, but actually this emphasizes the sort of care harm moral foundation as it's talking about LGBTQ rights. Being able to automatically decode it requires knowing a lot about what's going on in the world, right? So this is, again, a very challenging problem. It's not just, spotting keywords. All right, so this is really a challenging problem. The secret sauce in being able to do it has to do with not just using the text as a surface form, but rather providing additional context through the use of social media. In this case, the fact that we talked about social media as being this harmful thing in which we can spread news without any sort of central authority. But however, we can also use that to give us context when we're analyzing news and information. So each one of those tweets comes from a person who has followers, who has people that they follow, that they've liked, and so on. This social network provides us with context, allowing us to make fairly reasonable analysis over massive amounts of data. I'm almost out of time. A couple of things that we identified when we worked with this data. We looked at the framing behavior around the Affordable Health Care Act. And one of the trends that we've noticed that Republicans that voted with the Democrats frame their ideas about the Affordable Health Care Act using the same frames as the Democrats. And they were the only ones who did it compared to the other Republicans. So if you want to think about this kind of framing analysis as a way to predict, to forecast how people are going to vote, or how politicians will vote later on, this is an interesting thing to look at. And when it comes to analyzing the dynamics of discussion on social media, we looked at how mass shooting events were framed, and we saw that there is some difference. Like Republicans start to talk about thoughts and prayers, and then start to talk about policy items after 24 hours, while Democrats talked about both about social solidarity, thoughts and prayers, and about gun control policies on the first day. The secret sauce for all of this analysis, like I said, is finding social linguistic representation. A fun example that I like to give here is the sentence, "this is sick," could, for the people over 18 in this room, means that maybe you want some chicken soup. For the people under 18, it should be pronounced something like, "this is sick," and it means something good. I'm saying this with a grain of salt because by the time I wrote these slides, the slang might have changed. So it's hard to keep up. As was also mentioned here, the words thoughts and prayers, which until about a year ago just means, this is an expression of solidarity, has also been politicized and now means something different depending on the speaker. When Republicans say thoughts and prayers, they mean social solidarities. When people on the left say thoughts and prayers, they mean it as a point of criticism for the lack of political action on gun control. If we, despite the fact that these are identical, if we represent the context of the person tweeting this, we can know what is the intended meaning. The last piece of work that I want to talk about, which is our current work, where we try to provide context for longer news narratives. In this case, we assume that the news that are consumed, these are longer news narratives, and they are consumed by different people, and it's up to us to try and find ways to construct the social context. We do that by trying to identify who spreads these kind of news articles, and we build this social network where we identify which links for these news articles are shared by which users, and then we look at the tweeting and retweeting and following relationships between those users who spread this information and other users with known political affiliation. This is a very idealized way of looking at this. This is a more realistic one. It's hard to make sense of it. This is for a subset of the data, and still it's sort of messy. The nice thing that we see that if we just rely on that without any explicit supervision at the level of the text, we're able to make quite a bit of sense of those news articles. So the points here are news articles. The spatial locations is indicative of similarity in content, and the color is their underlying political bias. And you can see that despite not knowing anything about where is the source of the news, and the fact that two news articles discussing the same issue are likely to use a very similar language, we're still able to push those news articles apart and cluster them into roughly different clusters, where the blue is sort of left-leaning outlets, the red is right-leaning outlets, and the green are sort of unaffiliated or centric ones, right? And this is just based on sort of projecting the social relationships onto the text and clustering those articles based on that. OK, I'm over time, so just a few last words. I don't know if I have good answers, or I don't know if I answered the question that I posed in the beginning. This is a very, very challenging and difficult problem. A couple of things that I know that we need to do is we have to think about language understanding in a broader context. We have to model the social relationships that underlie the people who write these texts. We need to have systems that can infer the intent and reason about the outcomes of the events that are described there. And based on that, we can sort of level the playing field. Similar to HAL, what I presented a couple of slides ago, we need to find a version of this problem that is realistic, thinking that we can come up with a completely, like a perfect curator of information that would be able to tell us, well, this is fake and this is true, this is biased and this is real in some sense, is overly idealistic. And in some sense, it's not clear that you can or that you even want to tell people what's true or not, right? Have an algorithm that can do it. But instead, you can try and inform people about what is the source of the information and provide them with the relevant context that would allow them to make better decisions. And if there is one challenge that would push us more towards the direction of Dawn in this specific scenario, I think that would be it, right? Finding ways to integrate computer analysis to help inform people to make better choices. All right, thank you.
One question?
Well, thank you for the speech. I just have one question about the natural language processing, the speech you gave. You said that neural networks have limits on understanding the underlying political stances of like Twitter posts or like Instagram posts. But we're still using sentiment analysis or like attention mechanisms to analyze those contexts or sentences. Then this implies that there is certain limit to what neural networks can do. And are you thinking of any other solutions, let's say using like reinforcement learning or any other related techniques?
OK, so in general, neural nets are a specific model or a specific algorithm and model for analyzing data. And for certain problems, it's going to be very effective. For others, it's going to be less effective. In general, all the models that you can construct only are as good as the level of representation that the model can work with. If you have a neural net that works over abstract information, for example, if we're able to push the raw Twitter text into the sort of framing and moral foundation analysis, then it would be much easier for a neural net or for any classifier to make better decisions or nuanced decisions. If it only relies directly on the text, the word themselves, this is not enough information, right? We need to provide the relevant context, right? So the specific algorithm may not be the main challenge, right? Reinforcement learning could be applicable in one context when you don't have direct supervision, but the way I think about the problem is as a representation learning problem.
So are you implying that without the context or without the background information, neural networks cannot overcome human judgment?
I don't know what you mean by human judgment here.
Yeah.
I'm saying that when it comes to problems where human judgment relies a lot on common sense and world knowledge, neural nets that do not have access to it would find it extremely challenging to only use data to make correct predictions.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you.